Book Buzz, HarperCollins Book Buzz. Check it out. Do-do-do, Book Buzz, HarperCollins Book Buzz. Brought to you by Library Love Fest.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Hi, Lainey.
Hi, Virginia.
I'm Virginia Stanley, Director of Library Marketing at HarperCollins Publishers, joined by Lainey Mays, Library Love Fest team extraordinaire. And we're here with a really wonderful episode. We're so excited about this. Today, we're going to be speaking with author Laura Zigman, as well as her publisher, Helen Atsma, VP Publisher from Ecco, and Miriam Parker, VP Associate Publisher, Ecco. We would like to bring everyone on. Hello.
Hi, Virginia.
Hi.
Hi, Helen. Hi, Miriam.
Hi, Laura.
I don't know when I've been so excited.
Me either.
Listen, this has been, we've been talking about Laura Zigman's book since the manuscript came through. I don't even know when that was. Small World. This is a beautiful, heartfelt novel about two sisters, adults who have divorced and are reconnecting and trying to course correct their relationship. And there's so much to unpack in this book. There's humor, there's heart, there's when you love something so much, it's hard to talk about it without stumbling, which is what I'm doing right now. So I'm going to welcome everyone here. Helen Atsma, VP Publisher, Miriam Parker, VP Associate Publisher, and of course, Laura Zigman. A brief bio of Laura, and then we'll get into it. So Laura, you're the author of 5 novels, including Separation Anxiety, which was optioned by Julianne Nicholson, and the production company Whip that did Mayor of Easttown. So that's going to be a TV series, very exciting. And Animal Husbandry, which was made into the movie Someone Like You, which was starred Hugh Jackman and Ashley Judd. Dating Big Bird, Her, and Piece of Work. You've also ghostwritten and collaborated on several works of nonfiction, and you've been a contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Huffington Post. Your 6th novel, Small World, will be published in January 2023. You're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so librarians, knock on Laura's door, which means email us if you want Laura to come to your library, because she is a wonderful storyteller in every possible way, in writing these wonderful books and talking about her books, which we're going to do now. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
So
we were talking right before we start. I'm just going to say this right up front. First of all, I'm so honored to be published by Ecco, edited for the first time by Helen, and published by the second time around with the team, including Miriam and Sonia Shoes. And I said before in the green room that one of the best parts of being published by HarperCollins is this incredible library team. And you guys, I'm often watching the stuff on the Facebook Live because I love the authors you pick and love the conversations you have. So I'm really honored to be here for the second time. So thank you for having me.
Oh, Laura, that's so kind of you. Thank you. That means so much to us. Seriously, it's writers like you who bring stories like Small World and Separation Anxiety, which was amazing. You make our jobs easy and fun and an honor. And folks, if you haven't read Separation Anxiety, which is a fabulous novel, do. That was a wonderful novel. I pulled up a quote from the Washington Post about that. And I'm just going to read a smidge of it because it sort of reminds me of, it could apply to Small World, because it says the light from Laura Zigman's new novel, now we're talking about Separation Anxiety, is generated by a kind of literary nuclear fusion, an intense compression of grief and humor. Zigman has a great humorist's eye for the comedy we've seen but overlooked. Stalked by the loneliness of middle age, you may think the last thing you need is a novel about a woman driven to wearing her dog, and you would be wrong. So, of course, this book, Small World, is not about a woman wearing her dog to fill the void, but it is just a perfect blend of grief and humor. As I said before, Kirkus review, you have so many reviews. Lainey, can you show some of those right now? Kirkus says Zigman excels at depicting the emotional push and pull of sibling relationships, yet she never loses her sharp sense of humor, a compassionate, often funny examination of shared family, grief, and love. That is just one of many raves for this book. As you can see by these slides, I'm telling you, folks, so many of you I know have already read it, so we'll get into the heart of this book now. Helen, can you talk a little bit about how Small World came together? Librarians love to hear the behind the scenes information. So can you tell us about the first time that you read this novel? And then we're gonna hear from the author herself.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'll first say, my introduction to Laura's writing was reading Separation Anxiety, although of course I knew of her by reputation before then, but I had joined Ecco at the very end of 2019 and began working with Laura then. Separation Anxiety was already finished, and we published it in the amazing month of March of the following year. And so I think we went to, what was the last book party I went to for 2.5 years, right as it came out, and that's where I got to meet Laura. But anyway, when I joined Ecco, and everyone was like, you're going to get to work with Laura Zigman. She's amazing as a human being and an incredible author, and that's where I fell in love with her work. I think Separation Anxiety is, what you were saying, Virginia, it's incredibly funny and moving, and yes, about a woman who wears her dog in a sling, but so much more than that, a portrait of a marriage and crisis. I think when you reach kind of the middle ages and you're thinking like, is this all there is? Is there more than this? What's this next chapter in my life going to be? So, at Ecco, we're so privileged to have it's a pretty small list, and we like to say we're a very author-centric house, and that means that we get the opportunity to work with a lot of writers over the course of many books in their career. And so in this case, when I think Laura had maybe written 70 pages or 50 pages of Small World, her agent called me and said, Laura's been working on something new, and do you want to see it at this point? And of course I said yes. And for those of you who have not yet read Small World, it opens up with there's two sisters. I mean, Virginia spoke about this a little bit. They're both I think also we can say they're middle-aged. They've both just gotten divorced. One lives in California, the other lives in Cambridge. They're both a little broke, and so the California sister is like, can I move in with you, to her sister that lives in Cambridge? And of course she says yes, but they haven't really been in close touch for like 30 years. And meanwhile, the makeup of the apartment building or the house where there's a few tenants has changed, and these new neighbors are moving in upstairs, and they're completely bananas. And these two sisters who haven't been in each other's direct periphery for a long time are all of a sudden in each other's hair, and they clearly love each other and are also driving each other insane. And I know we're going to share some slides in a little bit about the found poetry that one of the sisters connects on a site called Small World, which is sort of like next door, and it's where the neighbors are all keeping tabs of each other. What we learn is that these sisters have never really talked about this very central event in their life, which is that there was a third sister who died when they were all children, and who'd been sick for a long time and had really taken up a lot of their parents' attention, necessarily so during this time. And they've never really grappled with this, and they need to, in order to kind of what was that? What was mom doing? Where were we? What was going on? Was anyone even paying attention to us in a way, even as they can see now as adults? of course, their parents had to be so focused on their other sister, whom they all loved deeply. And so for me, I could see already in these 50 pages, oh my God, there's a whole world here. Speaking of a small world, and I can't wait to see where Laura takes this story. And then maybe, I don't know, was it a year and a half later, Laura, something like that? There came a full manuscript on my desk. And I work differently with all of my writers. They need different things. Sometimes I buy a book when there's been 50 pages, and it's helpful for that writer to, hey, can I then send you the next 50 and the 50 after that? And we kind of build it that way. And for some writers, it's like, Laura's a pro. She's been doing this a long time, and she went off and wrote it. And, I loved it. And we did, I think, a few rounds of editing, but it was all there. And yeah, such a pleasure to see where it was when it began. But also, I think, Laura, your vision was fully realized. And
well, it's really funny because it really wasn't. The split screen of that story is like me on the other side going, oh my God, now I have to write this. And I really didn't know where or how it was going to come together, because I had all these little elements. And when I started it, it was in the middle of lockdown, and all I really had was the sense of these very annoying people upstairs. When I live in Cambridge, and we lived in the burbs for a long time, sold our house and moved to Cambridge about eight or 9 years ago, and been renting. And we had just a really quiet upstairs person, someone who worked at Harvard and traveled all the time. We never saw her. And then all of a sudden, the landlords who live in the house, they're great, moved their friends upstairs. And all of a sudden, it was like in the novel, all this weird noise was happening. And so there was this comic situation for me, I thought, to explore. And at the time I thought, well, maybe it'll be a couple, the way it has been, with us living downstairs, and with these, how we kind of dealt with it, which was not good, because we get easily aggravated. And then I just thought, I don't want to write about a couple. I just wrote about a couple. I don't want to write about marriage. I never want to do that again. It's enough. So then I thought about writing about the sisters. And then it really seemed like a perfect opportunity to explore a part of my own personal history that I had never quite written about fully in fiction. So, yeah.
Would you be able to talk a little bit about that?
Oh,
here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a family, I grew up outside of Boston in Newton, and my oldest sister, who I barely knew, she was born first. Her name is Cheryl, and she was born with a very rare bone disease where her bones didn't produce bone marrow. And she was institutionalized in a really well-known place outside Boston called the Fernald School, Walter E. Fernald School. And she went there, I think, when she was 3. She was born in 1958. So she went there probably in like 1961, something like that. I say this because I don't know. My parents are gone, and I didn't ask enough questions when they were around. But she lived there for most of her life. She died there when she was 7. Her bones didn't produce bone marrow, so she became, in the parlance of the day, retarded. It used to be called the Walter E. Fernald School for Retarded Children. And then it became developmentally disabled. Of course, we use different language now. But she lived there till she was 7. I was 3 when she died. My older sister, Linda, was 5. And so we didn't really know her, but we lived in the shadow of this terrible thing that had happened for my parents. And there were so many interesting parts of it for us, not having experienced the death of a sibling that we really knew. Was just, it changes, your whole family, and you have, your parents are very different than maybe they would have been if they hadn't had such a loss. And one of the really interesting things was that my parents stayed really involved with there was a fundraiser, like a group called the Fernald League of Parents. And there was a big parents movement in the 70s that took place to, lobby for disability rights, both nationally and locally. Anyway, but they stayed involved with the parent group at Fernald. They fundraised for years and years. I mean, most of the time, most of my childhood was spent going to different functions and fundraisers and stuff. Very low key kind of stuff, nothing fancy. But and Cheryl had been dead for a very long time, so those families stayed in our lives for really, for decades. And so it really defined us in a way. And yet I think a part of me had always been a little bit resentful that I felt, that I lived in the shadow of a dead sister. Like sometimes I was like, I'm here too. And when you're young, you just, you know that they're doing the best they can. And my parents, they were really great people, but they were, they were, grieving a lot of the time for a very long time. And so it changes things. And so whenever I thought about when I moved back, I lived in New York and I lived in Washington. And when I moved back to Boston, I had years and years when I could have gone to the Fernald School. It was still open, functioning in many ways. And I finally went over there, drove over there. It had already been sold to the town of Waltham. I was trespassing. I got on the grounds and I was chased off by police. But I was like, both my parents were dead by then. And I was like, you had to wait this long. Like I missed the boat, but yeah, I was only ready when I was ready, because I think I felt in some way like I had spent so much of my life in that shadow, and I didn't want to do it anymore. Except now, of course, now I'm so curious and I wish I could kind of know much more than I know. But for the purposes of fiction, I made a lot up. In the novel, Eleanor is the third sister, and she has a significant disability. She has pretty severe cerebral palsy with a seizure disorder and blah, blah, blah. And she lives at home for most of her 10 years, unlike my sister. So it was kind of the reverse, because I've known a lot of people who have kids who are special needs or disabled or whatever. And when they live at home, it takes up a lot of time and space and a lot of the energy of the parents. And I was always fascinated by that. And so I wrote about what that would be like to grow up where the child is in the house and getting a lot of the attention, necessarily so. So that was the impetus for it.
Interesting. That I feel like so many people, when they interview novelists, they want to know what's true.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting, and I feel like so many novelists actually what they do is write what they don't know and the path that they didn't take. I mean, this is, and it's so interesting listening to you, because I've always actually thought of you, Laura, as someone who's very good at taking real life and making it into a novel. But actually, this is you've done something so different with this book, which is taking a kernel of your personal story, but wondering what would it have been like if things were different. So it's just so interesting. Yeah,
well, you're a novelist too, as we know. Miriam's a novelist, you take. I when I first started, I thought, well, I'll just make it the same. I'll have it be where, and then I thought will be the dullest, most grim. Nothing will happen. You won't ever see this child. You won't see. I mean, how could I write? So then I thought that for actual fictional dramatic purposes, you have to make it there has to be action, there has to be scene, there has to be something. And then I thought, I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to do it a completely different way. And this I knew a family in Cambridge, they're acknowledged in the back of the book, who have a daughter named Eleanor, and she has a significant disability, and their whole family really revolves in the best possible way around her. Every dinner, every function, every barbecue, every walk. And I was fascinated because it's a very upbeat family, despite the fact that there's just so much involved in her care. And so I thought, okay, I'll do it that way, where she's, the sister is very present. So, yeah. But it is fictionalized, but those pieces, those emotional threads are so real. So that's,
I loved the relation. Before we got on, Lainey and I were talking about the sisters, and Joyce and Lydia, and what did you think of her, and what, and we in your hands, I mean, these are women who came to life in a very fierce way, because I've talked about this book so much, and I at times felt like this was nonfiction, because you just have these sisters down so perfectly. They push each other's buttons, and they piss each other off, and I think it's interesting too that you made them, they're all 2 years apart, aren't they? Yeah. So Joyce, who's the narrator, is 4. Eleanor was, six, and then Lydia was 8. So there's 2 between them. And so, that whole birth order thing too, and so Lydia's the one who's come back from LA, and she's got a couple of years on these other 2 sisters. And so they have similar but different takes, I think, on what that childhood was. You know, they have different takeaways, but it's so interesting that she sort of takes off. She says, like, you know, when she's of age to go, she's
Yeah.
out of there. She can't wait to get away. And there's Joyce saying, what do you mean you're leaving? And I'm here with all of this, you know, and being sort of, as you say, they're loved, but because they can walk and they can talk and they can take care of themselves, you guys go over there. And it's just so good. And also the settings. I mean, you know, the 70s and the shag carpet and I mean, it's so of the moment at that moment. And you just, I'm there. I mean, everybody's who's read this is just they're there with the time and the place and these children, you know, and what their lives were like. And as you say, that there's no other way to know how it all would have turned out, because this is what you get. And how does it affect the mother? And so she dives into all of this, you know, work on behalf of children, but still, it's like these little kids are here and they're just, you know, I don't know. This book is just so wonderful on so many levels. And how you know, you bring that Samsonite full of childhood stuff with you, and here they are, grown-ups, still trying to figure it out, and still, you know, yeah, I don't know if they're blaming each other, but there's just stuff that they have to deal with, and it's just so beautifully done. It's just so respectfully done.
Well, I mean, if any, you know, we all, I'm sure most of us on this panel have siblings or sisters, and you know, there's such a comical aspect to it too. So when I was writing this, for me, the entry to it was really like, what if my sister, who I love, we're very different, but you know, she moved away after college, and I stayed, and that was my choice and that was her choice and all that. But like, I thought, well, God, you know, what if she moved back? And what if we were both divorced? And what if she moved in with me? Oh my God. And then the comic potential for that, because I knew very quickly that, you know, she has that whole California sensibility, as I gave Lydia, the older sister who moves back. But my real sister too, you know, she's lived in California longer than she's lived on the East Coast. And those of us on the East Coast know what that means. We know the shorthand for that is like, we are grim and dark and we are critical. And she has this sort of sunshiny. And I knew instantly that if the sisters moved in together, my sister would be like, oh, she would sort of play along at first, and she'd be like, oh yeah, people upstairs, deeply annoying, very annoying. And then very quickly she would turn to me and just be like, God, you're so negative. You know, she would want to go upstairs and become friends with them and take the classes, do yoga with them. And I thought, oh my God, this is the perfect engine to sort of like propel and unmask their relationship, because there is so much stuff from childhood. We all have it. I mean, these two have a particular kind of history where they were both, you know, they each had their own minor issues. You know, Joyce had a stutter, and Lydia is dyslexic in the story. So, and they were overlooked as children because in the grand scheme of things, compared to a severe case of cerebral palsy, you know, you stutter, you know, it was the 70s. Nobody cared. You know, nobody really knew what that meant, or dyslexia. It was hard to diagnose. Like, so they were kind of like, and that was, you know, that was parenting, you know, for those of us who grew up in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, parenting was completely different. It was this sort of benign neglect under the best of circumstances, and like no seatbelts and this and that. But, you know, people just had a whole different, and especially if you grew up like we did. I mean, yes, my sister had died by then, but we knew enough, unless we were bleeding, you know, like, don't ask for anything, or don't really ask, you know, make a fuss, because we didn't feel like we could, you know, we didn't want to make them feel like they had to do anything. And they did, you know, they were fine. They were, you know, but unless you were really struggling or suffering. And even then, I don't think I ever told, like, if I was bullied or, you know, I never, but it was just a different thing. And so these two sisters really have a lot of that, you know, coming into their adulthood. They have all these unresolved issues, and who got more attention, even though there really wasn't much to get to begin with. And and all siblings have those things. I mean, you get together for a holiday and suddenly it's like someone says something and suddenly you're like screaming at each other and spitting because you're just like, and you're like, I'm 5, you're 7, and now we're back in the kitchen and you took my devil dog, and you know, how do we resolve this? So there was a lot of humor there, and then a lot of really deep stuff too. And to my sister's credit, you know, she really trusted me to write. You know, I kept saying it's going to be fiction, and of course there's like stuff that is not fiction, and she was very, very good about it when she read it. So I felt very lucky to have that kind of freedom to write what I wanted to write.
There's so many wonderful scenes in this book, but I, you know, the joy is in the reading, but when she goes away, when they take her to the camp, and then the girls, can you just talk about it for a little bit?
Yeah, you know, I did a lot of research for the book, and research it for me is really fun because it gets to just prolong and procrastinate the actual writing. So I tend to do as much research as possible. And I remember I was had just had COVID, and I had gone away for about a week to Gloucester to kind of get started on this. And I ended up watching Crip Camp, which was the Obama's first documentary that they did through Netflix. And it was about a camp that I had no knowledge of. So this is kind of a fictionalized version of that camp, because that camp existed and several other camps like it existed. They were like basically camps in Western Mass, maybe upstate New York. I think the one that they filmed the history of was the one in Western Mass. But it was like a regular boys and girls camp that for a few weeks over the summer turned into a camp for disabled kids. And it was really low tech. They had counselors who weren't, you know, they were kind of college kids that were bussed up from different parts of the country. And it was really low, like it wasn't an institutionalized kind of place. It was like wild. They smoked pot, and the kids were, but they were really, there were kids in wheelchairs, kids, you know, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, very severe cases of physical disabilities and stuff. And it was just an incredible documentary because a whole group of campers became leaders in the national disability movement. And I think Judith Herman became an advisor for the Obamas and the Obama White House, and just many, many people from that era, those camp days, were so empowered by that brief experience at that camp because they were treated like people. Everyone had something. They could be, you know, they could sort of feel gross, but not be great. They could just do whatever they wanted and feel like everybody had their own thing, and they didn't have to feel any shame. And they, you know, they were treated like actual people. And that gave them this just intense sense of empowerment that they carried through. They all ended up doing, in fact, one of the filmmakers was at the camp. I mean, he was a camper. And so they lived in, I think they're all still alive, except maybe one or two. But I was so inspired by that piece of history that I didn't know. And I thought, well, what if they had that experience where they took Eleanor to a camp like that? And then I, of course, fictionalized on top of that, but yeah.
I love that. Miriam, you have overseen the publication of both of Laura's novels here, plus back in the day, one of her novels at Hachette. So can you talk about the experience of working with this wonderful author over time?
Well, it's, you know, what's so fun about publishing and being in publishing for a long time. And like, Laura, I think actually I'm sure you have had this experience too, that like, you know, sometimes you just like strike upon like a person or a writer that you're just like, I like this person, you know. And so when your book Piece of Work came out, when I was like, you know, internet marketer back at Hachette, and I remember just like, you know, you were good at the internet and like I was the internet girl, and you know, we sort of just, you know, connected, and I just kept following each other over the years and always sort of just kept in touch. And so I never really thought that, I didn't know that we would work together again, but I was just like, I like Laura Zigman, she's the best, you know, and I loved your book then. And then when Separation Anxiety came on submission, I was like, of course, like a maniac, and I was like, we have to do it, you know. So it's just been like, I mean, and I'm sure you have maybe even, I don't know if you still have, I'm sure, I know you still have relationships from when you work in publishing and like as a publicist and maybe with authors, but also with, you know, with editors at magazines. And like, it's just so cool that like these things kind of keep going, you know? And so, I mean, it's been a true joy to me to like to, you know, be able to reconnect with you after all these years, but also we like kind of kept in touch over the years. I think just because like, it was, you know, like we just, you know, we're like kindred spirits or something. I don't know. That sounds cheesy. But, you know, Helen and I have that relationship too, actually, which is very strange also, which I think you guys know that like Helen and I both started in publishing around the same time. She was an editorial assistant and I was a internet marketer.
20 years
Again,
ago.
like,
Woo!
I didn't know that.
Yeah, at Little Brown, like back in the day. And so, and again, like Helen and I think we always sort of liked each other, though we didn't work together that much. And then like kind of went our separate ways and then like came back together at Ecco. So it's just like a lot of paths, especially with this group, like a lot of paths like converged and then diverged and then came back again. And it just brings, I love it a lot.
Yeah.
Laura, is it for you? I mean, you've worked what I would say on like both sides of the industry.
Yeah.
You've been an in-house, you know, book publicist. You've ghostwritten, as Virginia was saying. You are a literary writer. Sometimes I think that can be a blessing and a curse for my authors. I mean, just because it's amazing, you know, everybody and you know kind of how the cookie is baked, if you will. Yeah. But also is it hard to like remove yourself, like focus on the art? And I don't know, like talk about that.
No, because, you know, the writing part, and I do some coaching and writing therapy now for writers who I will never name, but you know, it's always my advice, and I have to say, I tell myself the same thing, like you can't write for anyone else, you can't write for the marketplace. You know, 10 years working at Random House as a publicist for different divisions, including Knopf, was like, people think they know what the bestseller is going to be or what book is going to work. And it's a mystery and nobody knows. And if you try to write into a genre or a particular kind of book, you know, you have to write what excites you. You have to write a story that is going to keep you interested. Okay, this one didn't take me as long to write, but like sometimes, you know, you have to stay with the book for a really long time and you better want to tell that story, because otherwise the drafts you have to go through, you know, the drafts before, Helen, the ones you didn't even see, you know, all the drafts before you show your editor, and then the back and forth that you do, and then the copy. Oh my God, if you do not love your story, you'll just die, you know, so if you're writing something that is, you know, and it won't work, you won't be able to crack the code on a bestseller anyway. So for me, it really is like, you know, what is the story? What is the next story I want to tell? Why is it interesting? And what is it about the story that I'm going to want to really get into? And then everything else you just have to really put aside. You have to. And so it is, you know, and I just love the business too. It's like so inside baseball, because I mean, Virginia and I were talking just before this, but you know, I loved being in publishing. My job as a publicist was super stressful. So I have all the, you know, the lines here, and it aged me probably enormously, but I did love the job and love the people I worked with. I'm still really close friends with the people. It's so funny you say that you guys met as assistants, because Julie Grau, who at Spiegel and Grau, and Ivan Held, who runs Putnam, I mean, we have a nickname for each other, which I'm not supposed to tell, but the three of us were assistants way back in the 80s, and we're still so close now. And I have a lot of those people just, you know, who I may not see or talk to for a long time, and then I'll email them and they're like, you know, it was a great business of people, like-minded people. And so to be, you know, to have taken such a long break from it for me in fiction was heartbreaking, because I felt like I was out of my, didn't have the people I loved in the business I loved. And so to be back writing my own stuff again has been really nice, even for that, is because I get to kind of come back again and like do this and be part of it.
Was there anything from ghostwriting that like influenced you in terms of your fiction? I like, it must be, it's such a different muscle, but also like you're like kind of like step back from it, right? Like how does that change your writing?
Ghostwriting is a really interesting, weird thing. I was really lucky for the most part to work with people I really liked. It was one of those things where I had a really severe case of writer's block, and I just could not write my own stuff. And I needed to earn a living, I had a mortgage to pay. And I started to ghostwrite. I wrote, in the first book I ghostwrote was for a television matchmaker on A&E. And I totally talked myself. They contacted me. Would you be, yes. And I had no idea. And I had dinner with them. They hired me, and I was like, oh, I got the job. Now what? And I ended up contacting a Newton person in Newton who I knew, William Novak, who was a really big, famous ghostwriter in the 80s and 90s. And it was way before his son BJ became BJ Novak from The Office. But I had met Bill at a library function in Newton. As a matter of fact, see, you guys, this is what gave me my living for a decade. But Bill and I were at a library function at the Newton Public Library, and we met. He was the nicest person. And I emailed him like a year later, and I was like, hi, I don't know if you remember me, but I told him the story. I got this ghostwriting job. I said, if I could just ask you, and before I knew it, he was calling me. He gave me 2 hours on the phone, and he basically was he was like, here, get a pencil. He was like, do this, don't do this, get a tape recorder, don't go and watch them work. It's a waste of time. He gave me all these little tips. And he was like, if you ever need any help, call me. And I mean, he was so kind to me. And it was one of those things where you kind of figure it out. Yeah, I've spent a lot of my life feeling like, okay, stupider people than me have figured this out, so I can do this. I don't know what I'm doing. I've never written a novel before. I've never ghostwritten a book before. I have no idea what I'm doing. But like, other people have done it and they don't know, so I'm just gonna. So ghostwriting was kind of like that. And I was really lucky to work with some great people whose stories were really interesting. And when you're working with someone and they've trusted you to tell their story, and they tell you things that they often have either never told anyone or many people, or they have never. I remember getting a call from one of the people I worked with, and she called me really late one night. She said, you know more about me than any single person, because she maybe had told pieces of her past and her story to other people, but not the same person. And you've signed an NDA, so you're kind of, they feel safe ish. And when someone really trusts you and you like them and you admire them, it's a real honor to tell someone's story. I mean, it's very hard. You're often chasing people around the world because they're famous and they don't have time. But when you are on the phone with them and they're telling you something, everyone has a story. Everyone has a really painful piece of their childhood or their past, loss, and when people are really telling you those stories and you're listening, and it is, some of the things I've heard I'm telling you are like mind-blowing. And it's like a big honor to do that. And then sometimes you work with people you just cannot stand, and it cannot end fast enough. So it is really runs the gamut. But the projects I really loved. And I got to work with, like Eddie Izzard was really a really wild, incredible person. And Wendy Davis was great. I mean, I was lucky. I worked with some really cool people. Some people I can't talk about, including Martha Stewart's daughter. I'm not allowed to say I worked with, but I did. So.
Did you just say that?
I did. Who said? No,
Nobody.
I think that you said it. I didn't.
I
say
did. I said it.
Redacted.
Redacted.
Redacted. Hey, we have jumping in anytime, anybody, but I want to get to some questions here. Lainey and I are looking at the string of questions here. So Miriam, Helen, by no means does this mean no more chatting, or Laura, and nobody's going to come and turn us off at 3 o'clock. So please don't feel that way. But I do want to get to the questions because folks have been listening. And so with lots of love, lots of comments. And so maybe, can we do that right now? Is there anything that actually, we did want to talk about the poetry. Let's do the poetry really fast. Yeah. We should show them. And then we'll get to the questions, I promise. Every single one of them.
So should I talk over the poetry slide? So I have a friend on Facebook. He's an American Studies professor at University of Maryland in Baltimore. And he's one of my oldest friend's brothers who became wicked smart, as we say in Boston. and he used to post on Facebook a couple of times a month. He would just post. He would take a posting from his local listserv in Baltimore, which is like next door, and he would just cut the post. He would take the verbatim and he would just cut it into lines of poetry and post it on Facebook. And he started to post them, and I wrote to him and I was like, you should do a book of these. These are so brilliant. And he's like, well, I'm kind of busy. You know, he had a job, a real job. And I was like, oh, I'm not. But I was so obsessed with them. I just loved when he would post them. And so of course I told him, and he's acknowledged in the book, but I did steal the idea because I thought I loved the poems, and I of course had to write them myself. But I would talk about research and procrastination. One of my favorite things to do, Helen, when I was unable to figure out the next step of the book, was I was like, oh, I can just go on Nextdoor and look for posts. So I had all these different categories I would look for, you know, turkeys and bad neighbors, noisy neighbors, and all these different things. And I just loved them. And then I would take them and I would rewrite them and make, change them and make them different. But I loved being on Nextdoor, and just the minutia of people's issues. And there's one, I don't think I was able to use this one, but it was like somebody wrote and said, hey, has this ever happened to anyone? We came out this morning and someone had put chunks of tuna fish on our driveway. Like, you just never know what you're going to find on Nextdoor. Someone thought it was to keep the raccoons away. I mean, it's always something going on Nextdoor. But these were.
I was howling when I was editing the book. We did decide to cut a few of them because I think
you were right. Yeah. It made the good ones.
I'm sorry.
Really yeah.
But the best ones, they were.
I have to say, Helen, your editing was just so good.
Oh.
Whenever I would go through when I went through first your big edit, and then each subsequent one was just like, I would always be like, oh, she's right, so much better. So less is more, But the ones you cut were perfect because it really made the ones that are there, I think.
I mean, this is amazing.
They're great, and they're throughout the book, and they just kind of like stop you and you read them, and they're just perfect, and then where you put them, and they're funny, they're thoughtful, and really written in sort of a poetic form. They really do read like poems, and they're really just postings. It's very, very funny.
I would just like to say I could have written much better poetry, but the point was to make them retain their weird Nextdoor kind of feel. Like, I could be a better poet than that's.
Yes.
We do publish poetry at Ecco.
Yes.
Up next, Laura Zigman's good Nextdoor poetry.
I'm up for that. I would be very up for that.
Oh, who's
John
behind
Kenny,
you?
Right? John Kenny's love poems. I love his stuff.
There's a dog behind you. Just jumped up on the bed.
I
know. We have so much love. So much love on Facebook. Like they've already come and gone. It was just like an inpour of love. And speaking of the dog, one of our librarians, Jennifer Winberry, tells us that they still have the separation anxiety bandana that was made. And they brought it up the other day. So I'm so happy a dog came through so I could say that. We have lots of questions. Jennifer had asked, I know you talked a little bit about this, but she asked why you didn't decide to write this as a memoir, or if you have.
That's a great question. That's a really great question because I did, sorry to talk over you. I did at one point try to write it as a memoir many years ago. And I realized I just did not have enough of a story. There just was not enough of a story to tell. There were a few sort of threads, but there wasn't enough actual, I didn't know my sister. I never really had long conversations with my parents about her. There just wasn't enough to write. And so this was the perfect format because I actually used some stuff I had tried to write in the memoir. A lot of the flashbacks that are in the second person, some of those are real fiction, really fictionalized. I mean, I never went with my sister to Paragon Park, which was an amusement park outside in the South Shore of Boston. But that's in a very imagined scene. And then there are other flashbacks that are much more, come from real life. But I just knew that there wasn't enough for an actual memoir. So this was actually the perfect way for me to write about it, because it feels very, very true to me, but there's a lot that is fictionalized from my
Yeah.
experience.
Lainey, do you have other questions there?
Oh, there are so many. So you
So,
just
I
have
mean,
to
there are so
stop
many.
me.
I don't know how many you can see, Lainey.
There are a lot of questions. I'm going to try to do a couple more, maybe if we want to jump back in, but maybe a couple more just so because everyone's very excited.
Oh, great.
Terry made a comment that this novel made me think about the history, and then it just went away. The history of families and what stories are not told, especially with the photoshopping. I know people have questions about that, but photoshopping in her day job, which is really funny.
Yeah.
And kind of sad that that's what she thinks of, but beautiful. So let's see. Jennifer wants to know, how did you choose to make Eleanor the middle child?
That I think I'm not really sure. I mean, obviously she was the oldest child, she would have been the oldest child in my own family structure, but I think it's just how it worked out in terms of, it was one of those things that Helen was like, the math here isn't working out. And it just, I don't remember exactly why it worked out that way, that she was the middle sister in the story. But that's just how it ended up.
Okay. Laura Rossi says, I'm a special needs parent. This book is a gift, beautiful, heartfelt, and moving, and it shines a light. And Janet Lockhart says, big fan of this book. I look forward to recommending it. I love Joyce's rendering of posts on her neighborhood website into poetry. Something about it is lovely yet poignant. This habit and her job organizing family photos into histories really illuminated her character for me. Where did you get this idea? Are you using actual posts from somewhere?
So I think I answered the first part of that, which is that I stole the idea from a friend of mine on Facebook who made those posts, and then I did write my own poems to sound like posts that were actually from next door, which I spent a lot of time on. The other part of the question was, can you repeat?
She wanted to know where you got the idea, and are you using actual posts from somewhere?
Oh yeah, okay. I thought she was also asking.
And also about the Photoshop
Yeah, that's
job.
really funny because, when I started to write this novel, Joyce was going to be a fact checker. And I thought, oh, this will be so great. I downloaded all these books on fact check, more time to procrastinate. I downloaded all these books on fact checking and blah, blah, blah. And then I kept trying to like integrate it in the story. It was just dead. I could not, it did not work. And then this is the other part of what I've learned about fiction, about writing in general, is like, no matter what you do when you're in that process of trying to figure out your book, you just have to like fill your brain. You have to read, you have to walk, you have to listen to when you think you're wasting time, you're actually. So one night I was listening to, I think it was This American Life, and I just was listening, and there was this great little piece of something that was part of a bigger part of the actual story, which was this woman who was obsessed with slideshows. She was just obsessed with these slideshows. Like she'd go to a bar mitzvah or a wedding or that, and I was like, oh my God, that's it. I would go to these things, or I'd go to someone else's graduation. She said I would sob at the other, and I didn't know these people. I didn't do this, I didn't know, but I was just like so moved. And I was like, that's it. So then I researched, and of course there are companies that make, all the whole thing. So, and then you can make it up if you want. I mean, it doesn't have to be a company that makes them. You could just pretend there is a company, but, so I completely was like, okay, that's her job. She's not a fact checker. I just couldn't get, I love the idea of somebody being a fact checker because it pushes all of my nosy, I have to prove, have to make sure it's the truth. But it just wasn't working. Couldn't get it to work. So I just loved that idea, which then became such a perfect vehicle for Joyce, because it is this like, you get to look at everyone's families and compare your own and feel like yours fell short in all the ways that these other people's, don't, whatever.
I love that.
Lainey, do you see the rest of Laura Rossi's question?
Ooh,
I have it.
Okay, yeah, if you have it.
I'm sorry, it got cut off, but here it is. Laura Rossi, a continuation of her post before. She says that the book shines a much needed light on the rich, loving, little told stories of siblings of special needs, disability, sisters and brothers or brothers. There is no other book, excuse me, there is no other book like Small World. It made me laugh, cry, nod, and say yes out loud. Telling the truth with humor and honesty is pure Laura Zigman magic. This book will open minds and hearts about family, love, heartache, challenges, and most of all, being seen.
Wow. So, I know Laura Rossi, and Laura Rossi is a phenomenal parent to two twins. One has special needs. And, I was tempted when I wrote this book to show it to some parents. And I chose not to, but ahead of time, because I felt that this was a sibling story. My parents had their own story, and parents of special needs children have their own story. It's very different than a sibling. And I felt I really wanted to tell my version of the story. But I did, of course, show it. And one of the most meaningful pieces of feedback I got was when it passed muster with someone like Laura Rossi, who, and we've had long talks about it, but, there is really an untold, one of, I won't say ghostwriting, but I did some work for some Sandy Hook parents, some Newtown parents. And I spent a lot of time there a couple of years ago, and I was so moved by them, of course, who wouldn't be. But what moved me the most, in a way, were the siblings of the families who lost children at Sandy Hook. And I'm always drawn to the siblings who are the surviving siblings, because for whatever, whatever it is, whether, family has a child who dies of cancer or whatever, I always think of the siblings. And I think there's research that's been done about siblings being I think they're called like the forgotten mourners or something, because when a family loses a child, particularly, for loss, everyone is so focused, understandably so, on the parents, but the siblings are, not only have they lost a sibling, they've also lost the parents in a sense, because they're not who, they're never going to be the same. And so the kids really lose that, the parents they knew before this thing happened. And when you grow up, in a family with special needs, so much attention is going to the child that needs the most help. And so there is this sense of like, there can be resentment, and there can be just intense love between the siblings, and they can understand everything, and they can still feel like, it's hard for the siblings. And so I'm really glad that she felt that it felt real to her, that it felt, respectful also, because I think one of the biggest fears is you don't want to tell a story like this and in any way do the wrong thing. You want to have the freedom to tell the story. I want to tell, and there's language in the book that, it was a different time and different words were used and all that. And still you want to feel like you don't want to ever say it in a way that is not, that is hurtful to somebody. So
Be respectful. Yeah,
Yeah.
I get that. And I have to say how hard it is to do well, to write a character who is never given their own perspective. Like the mother's never on the page other than memory. And I think that is so well done, because that's who I personally was feeling so much for, because I have to know those emotions are so hard to not be able to put into your own words, and then to kind of, we all work at our deficits. Like she might not have known how to reach out and
sure.
be a good parent to these other two people, and it's done so well that you never hear directly from her, but I felt for her.
Sure.
She's complicated. Yeah,
It is. And it's, under the best of circumstances, parents who parent special needs kids and have other kids. I mean, when I was growing up with our Fernald families, a lot of the families only had one child. So it wasn't an issue. They either had like fertility issues. I mean, this was a long time ago. So they had one child, and the child, was developmentally disabled or physically disabled, either from fertility treatments they'd had or whatever. And now, it's different. A lot of families I know, a lot of people I know have special needs situations, and you can be the greatest parent, and there's just not enough time in the day to do everything, you know, that you want to do for each kid. So it's hard.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many good questions here. There's one from Maureen Roberts. When you were talking about writer's block and suffering from writer's block earlier, she said, do you think ghostwriting made you a better, or maybe different is the word, novelist?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It definitely made me able to write, you know, that was for starters, because it was a job, you know, and I think when you have writer's block, there's just so much tied into performance anxiety, and, you know, and a lot of other things were tied into it too. But you also have to come up with a story when you're ghostwriting. Gee, you're just pulling it out of somebody. And I mean, you have to figure out how to tell it, and you have to get the voice right. There's a lot that you have to get right, but you're not fabricating a story. You're not making it up. Someone's giving it to you, and you just have to figure out how to put it together, and how to extract the best parts from someone. But it definitely made me able to write again. I mean, it still took a while to return to fiction, because I was still so blocked. But I think it definitely, I don't think I would have really started to write fiction again if I hadn't been ghostwriting.
So much love here. You know, people are watching from all over the country, and it's just really wonderful. Nicole Terry Williams says, I don't know if we asked, well, it's actually not a question. It's just, she says she loves how Joyce photoshopped into the pictures the safety devices of the soda cans instead of the beer cans. That was hilarious. You know, as we said at the beginning of this hour, there's pain in this book, but there's also humor in this book, and these voices are so authentic, and it's really about these, I don't know, these paths that they take, because it is what it is. This is how how it worked out for them, and so
when I was growing up, my father, sometimes I would be, you know, packing up to go back to college or something, and, you know, out in the driveway and putting my stuff in the back of the car, and I'd be driving myself. I don't even think I had a car. My sister was driving me back. Yeah, it would be the two of us, my sister and me, getting into a car ourselves to take me back to college. And my father would this was like a typical story of my family. He, you know, give me a hug, and then bye, you know, okay. And then he would whisper in my ear, "Don't die." And he didn't even know it was coming out of his mouth. But I think it's funny, but it's also like, you know, not everyone grew up like that, where like you're going back to college, your sister's driving you, and your father's like, "Please don't die." It would come out of his mouth like it was oozing out of his pores, because the two of us is like, oh, two of my girls are getting in a car. One is already dead, and now the two of them, they're driving off. What if they, you know, like that was when you grow up like that. You know, it is both. It's like ridiculous. You know, you see death everywhere. You feel this obligation not to also die, because you're like, my parents will kill me if I die. Like, don't die. So it's this like very black, dark world you live in, because like you're trying to have a life. And I did, you know, I did dangerous things and stuff like that. But still, like half of the time you're like, I can't die, because like, what will they do? You know? And then like, I'll have to leave my sister. Well, then what, you know, she'll be stuck. So it's just but those were moments of, there are a lot of things like that where if you don't grow up in a family like that, you have more of a happy, light kind of like thing. And it wasn't all grim at all. I mean, it's really funny. I just found my diary from 1974, and I was flipping through it, and I was like, okay, you know, it wasn't all bad. You know, we made cookies a lot, and, you know, we went here, we went there, and I had kind of a car singles thing. So it's peppered with, you know, we drove to the beach and I threw up, you know, that kind of thing. But there were actual fun. We did have, you know, one's memory too is really like, you know, maybe I'm looking at it in a certain way, but, you know, it's all real. It is a mixture. But, you know, I do forget that there were happy, there sure were happy times, you know, not a lot, but there were some.
I think for me, Laura, like this book, I just feel like everyone has just spent 2-3 years feeling just so disconnected from like physically for all the time, where we couldn't see our family and our neighbors and our friends, and like emotionally, like this Zoom is amazing. I'm so glad we can do this, but it's, how we're doing so much on Zoom and things like that now. And there's something about your book that it's so specific to the story of this family, obviously, and to your experience, but there's also something so universal about these women. Now they're resisting it too, but they're finally, like, they're seeking this connection and they're seeking these answers, and whether it's with their community and with each other, and it's very wry and acerbic, and there's like humor and darkness kind of woven through it. But I think ultimately, I don't know, that was what was so moving to me. I think so many, and I think also the book is not particularly political or whatever, but I think there's been like so much with siblings lately, and just feeling disconnected from each other for whatever reason, and seeing these two like find a path forward. I don't know. It's really, I think it's hopeful. I think it's ultimately like such a hopeful
I'm
read.
glad, because I was hopeful at the end. I think, my sister and I have had our ups and downs. Most families do. And I think when you can figure it out and forgive each other and move forward and have a relationship in adulthood that, if not explicitly heals the things you've done to each other, the things you've said to each other that you wish you hadn't said or whatever, if you can just find that way forward. And I think you're right. I think at this point right now, where the world is so different, feels very different, those connections are just everything. They're everything, whether they're with your biological family or with found family or whatever. It's those friendships and really, that closeness that all we have, really.
Wow. I think that's an important point to end on. Ooh, the light just went out in this room that I'm in. But I actually think that ending on the note of hope is a really great way to wrap up the conversation, because this is, in the end, a joy to read. It's a joy to read this book and to know these people, these characters, these women, and there's something in there for, I could go on and talk to you for forever about this. I mean, I'll just say one more thing. When you are with your friend, when the girls talk about, or I suppose when Joyce talks about what it's like, when you were just saying before, Laura, about, it wasn't all bad, and we did make cookies and we did have some fun. I mean, you're trying to set this balance, but in a realistic one. But when Joyce talks about her childhood and when they would go to other friends' houses and what that was like to go to her friend's house, who had a lot of kids in the family, and like there's just like this scene that you said, it's like a paragraph of like the mud room, the stuff that's in the mud. Everybody knows somebody who's got a mud room, and there's chaos, but it's fabulous chaos, and it's all these kids and this lightness and this crazy kids running around and cleats and all of that. And I thought, oh, it's what she wants, but she doesn't have that, but she sees it in her friends' homes. And I'm telling you, we could talk forever about this book. You've just drawn such a beautiful picture of life with these people. Thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you for having me. And thank you, Helen, for publishing me, and Lainey and Virginia, and for everyone who has taken time today to be here. Libraries mean everything to us now. They're a safe space for so many people. They're the place where we find the best books, and the librarians are the people that are a gift to all of us. And so I am so honored to be here, and I would love to get in my car and come to any library. New England, I love to drive, but thank you for this support. It really, really means a lot to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Helen, VP Publisher, Ecco, and Miriam Parker, VP Associate Publisher, Ecco. We love Ecco. We love the books that you guys buy and edit, and these wonderful authors. It's just the best. So, and Lainey, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful, we're looking forward to this for so long. And for everybody watching, thank you. Go out and read it if you haven't already. Small World goes on sale January 10th, which means if you're voting for Library Reads, and why aren't you if you're not? Votes are due December 1st. And thank you all so much for this wonderful hour. Take good care, Laura.
Thanks, you too. Thank you.
Bye,
See you next
everyone.
time, I hope.